the town that locked its gates at sunset. Residents of Graybridge in Skagit County, Washington, described a routine that rarely drew attention until the winter of 2019. Every evening, near civil twilight, the municipal swing gates at the north and south arterials were rolled shut and locked. The practice dated back to a flood mitigation plan that repurposed surplus highway barricades as neighborhood barriers. People accepted the ritual as ordinary, and few questioned who kept the keys or why the schedule never shifted. When an unexpected series of incidents clustered around closing time, the pattern became the story itself. The first documented night belonged to Everett Lang, 58, Public Works Maintenance Supervisor, on call to verify generator levels. He drove the service pickup along the riverfront approach while watching barometer readings fall and the wind stir powdered snow. According to dispatch logs, he radioed that the western gate lamp flickered despite a recent bulb change. He parked beside the frame at 4:21 p.m., marked the hinge plate with chalk, and indicated he would return a socket set. State records show his time card ended at 4:29 p.m., though the truck remained on site until after dark. In interviews recorded later, several drivers said the gate looked closed before sunset, which was unusual given the posted schedule. A school bus turned early, leaving 2 students to walk the long frontage path in rising wind. The bus contractor filed an incident note, and the county file from 2009 was cited to explain alternate routes. That file referenced water on roadway conditions during king tides, not early closures or padlock changes. Investigators never confirmed why the chain was moved one slot tighter on that particular evening. 2 nights afterward brought a second account from Mara Jensen, 33, substitute teacher, visiting a friend in town after a late shift. She reported the southern gate partially open at 4:47 p.m., with the reflective panel rocking slightly and then stilling as if held. Some locals claimed she misread wind gusts against the sign face, though the crosswind was recorded as modest. Jensen stated she called the non-emergency line and left a message describing a figure near the hinge post. Archived notes indicate no callback and no official sighting recorded that week. Graybridge had reasons to prefer early closures, including opportunistic dumping on the river pullouts during shoulder seasons. Yet council minutes show the adopted ordinance framed the gates as temporary storm furniture, not nightly perimeter control. The language specified seasonal deployment during marine layer advisories and elevated creek stages. In practice, the town applied the hardware every evening from October through March, then loosened schedules without a written addendum. Records conflict on who authorized the habit, and signatures on renewal notices rotate among 3 clerks. On the last Friday of November, the wind eased and the river flattened under an inversion haze that kept sounds oddly near. Everett returned with a junior technician to adjust the sticking hinge on the western frame. They noted ripples on pooled water inside the shoulder that looked like traffic vibrations without any visible vehicles. The technician logged a vibration test with a wrench against the post and marked slightly dull resonance. Minutes later, the gate swung with a slow finish despite grease on the bearing surfaces, and the lock clasp settled without a rattle. That same hour, Deputy Colin Ward, 47 County Sheriff's Office, ran a patrol loop that included the northern approach. He observed families cutting across the gravel to reach the diner before the gate closed, moving with the practice timing of regulars. Ward kept a neutral pace, logged plate numbers, and waved 2 teenagers through the opening with a small vertical hand motion. He later wrote that the gap appeared exactly the width of a compact car mirror span, which struck him as intentionally measured. Reportedly, he considered waiting by the hinge but diverted to a noise complaint near the mill. December brought earlier darkness, and the gates began meeting the sun halfway on clear days that should have stretched the schedule. A hardware store owner said the padlocks sometimes felt warm even in freezing air, then cooled quickly when exposed. A fisheries volunteer said the river sounded less present near the metalwork, like a muffled channel on a radio. Another resident described 3 short knocks from the empty lane that made a dog pull hard toward the ditch. Investigators never confirmed a single physical cause, and weather data offered only modest anomalies. Attention sharpened after a delivery driver photographed the southern gate with the chain fastened through a hole that did not exist earlier. The image shows a neat circle in the panel skirt, clean-edged, free of burrs, positioned where the angle iron meets the crossbrace. Public Works said no one issued a work order and the spare panel in storage had no matching hole. Some locals claimed the photo captured glare rather than new metalwork, though the exposure time was short and the light soft. Archived notes include a printout marked question feature with no follow-up entry. During the first week of January, a light snow covered the approach lanes and kept tracks readable until the plow made its pass. A single set of boot prints approached the western gate from inside town, stopped at the hinge side, then angled away toward the river footpath. The returning path never crossed back toward the lane, and the tracks faded where wind scoured the edge berm. Dispatch logs record Everett calling the footprint pattern in, requesting guidance before opening the frame for the morning commute. Ward logged arrival 8 minutes later and photographed the sequence from 4 angles with flash reflection on the chain. Ward's report states the hinge bolt showed a bright ring where recent friction removed road film. He measured the chain slack and counted links, arriving at a number that did not match the training sheet. The difference equaled 1 link, which could be explained by minor tension variations under cold conditions. He wrote that the padlock keyway pointed down when he left, a habit he maintained for rain management and quick checks. State records include the photo, and the keyway appears horizontal under direct flash. A week later, Jensen returned to town for a weekend district workshop and stayed at a friend's rental near the river. She walked to the store before sunset and paused by the southern gate after hearing a short metallic tap. She saw no vehicles and no pedestrians except a runner on the far path whose headlamp bounced steadily. Jensen described the tap, repeating twice, followed by a faint hiss like air leaving a tire at a steady rate. She declined to give an interpretation and asked that her name be recorded without additional context. By midwinter, the gates closed at a time that residents could predict without consulting the posted sheet. Tourists missed the window and parked along the highway shoulder, then walked in under a sky that turned quickly from silver to blue. A volunteer ushered them along with a flashlight and instructed them to step clear of the hinge arc. Public Works kept a second set of keys inside a red box at the fire station and signed them out for emergencies. Reportedly, 2 keys went missing for a weekend, then returned without a log entry. Everett's final detailed entry came during freezing rain, when locks often seized despite preventative lubrication. He noted a ticking sound from the shackle area that reminded him of thermal snap in roof tin. He warmed the lock body with a portable heater and watched the built-up moisture steam away in a thin ribbon. The ticking continued for 30 seconds and then stopped without the usual follow-on rattle. He closed the gate and left the heater running while he checked the opposite frame under a flat gray sky. The following afternoon, a contractor found a child's mitten lodged between the latch plate and the panel rib at the northern gate. No missing child report existed, and the school confirmed perfect attendance for the relevant classes. Some locals claimed the mitten blew from a passing stroller and bounced into the gap during a brief gust. The knit fabric was dry despite earlier drizzle, which the contractor wrote felt inconsistent with the time on his delivery receipt. Archive notes show the item was placed in a lost property bag and never claimed. Ward conducted a simple experiment with a digital recorder, a tape measure, and a bag of sand to dampen vibrations. He placed the recorder near the hinge and opened the gate to the width used during the dinner rush. He listened to playback and heard 3 faint taps spaced evenly, each followed by a very low tone near the noise floor. He repeated the test on the southern gate and captured 2 taps and no tone. Dispatch logs note that he filed the recordings under equipment anomalies without linking them to any active case. A regional inspector visited after a minor collision, bent a reflector bracket, and sent a cyclist to urgent care. The inspector stated the frames met standard, the locks were common issue, and the postings looked adequate for winter conditions. He recommended painting the chain with high contrast bands so drivers could judge closure state at a glance. The town followed the advice and logged the paint purchase under safety materials, second quarter. Records conflict on whether the painter applied a primer coat that might have altered chain stiffness under cold temperatures. In late February, snowmelt filled the culverts, and residents described a hollow roar under the approaches at odd intervals. The gates continued closing near sunset, neither early nor late, as if synced to a clock hidden somewhere in the routine. A visiting journalist asked who owned that clock and received 3 different answers, including a vague reference to legacy timers. Public Works denied any timer beyond the wall calendar pinned above the parts shelf. Some locals claimed an older control box once existed, but no one produced a serial plate or a retired schematic. On the last documented evening before the spring schedule eased, Jensen walked with Everett along the river path after a school event. They discussed ordinary matters and kept their hands in their jackets while the temperature settled close to freezing. At the western gate, they heard a small clink like a coin touching metal without falling. Everett lifted the chain 1 link and set it down, and the sound did not repeat. He checked the latch face and saw a faint crescent in the dust, then wiped it clean with a sleeve. When daylight extended past commuting hours, the gates were rolled open and nested against their posts, and the town breathed differently. No ordinance changed, and no notice was printed, and the habit slipped away as quietly as it began. A few residents kept notes about the winter schedule, including times, weather, and small irregularities that never shaped into conclusions. State records contain everything necessary to describe the mechanics and almost nothing that fixes intent. The files remain available, and the keys hang on a peg behind a steel door with chipped paint. The stories. Paramedic returned a ring to this hospital wing. The ring sat in a small evidence pouch with a folded intake label, and the label named this hospital wing. Security logged the delivery in the overnight book with a careful time, and they filmed the handoff at the ambulance bay. Calder Ruiz was 34, and he worked nights on a private ambulance that covered the mixed urban fringe. He drove a high-mileage rig with a sticky rear latch, and he kept a quiet notebook under the dash. He finished paperwork after sunrise when the cafeteria coffee tasted burnt and the elevators finally ran without packed gurneys. His simple plan for this morning made sense, and it fit the tired mood of the shift. He would drop the ring, sign the property line, and clock out before the traffic built. The ring was a plain yellow band with a shallow engraving, and the engraving read LK and May 14. He did not remember any patient who mentioned jewelry, and their overnight calls were ordinary transfers and one shortness of breath. The band came from under the bench cushion during cleanup, and he spotted it when a pen rolled and tapped. He pocketed the pouch because it felt wrong to leave it, and he headed for the East Wing desk. The East Wing used to hold telemetry and a step-down, and now it served as a rehab overflow when beds ran tight. The desk kept a property log from older times, and the same binder continued through years of tape and patchwork pages. The unit clerk looked at the label and frowned, and she called for the charge nurse by habit. The charge nurse checked the overnight admits and shook her head, and she said nothing matched a ring for this wing. She asked which patient lost it, and he told her none of their patients mentioned a ring at all. She said they could place it in central security, and they would open a claim if anyone asked later. He nodded but felt a tug, and the label still named this wing in plain handwriting. He asked if the desk ever handled stray property like that, and the charge nurse said it occasionally happened. A maintenance tech leaned from a ladder and listened, and he said the East Wing had its own ghosts by reputation. He laughed when the nurse shot a look, and he added that he meant the cardboard kind. He explained that old property envelopes sometimes turned up behind cabinets, and housekeeping would move them along. He said linens and small items traveled strange paths when movers closed floors, and people forgot until someone asked later. Calder thanked him, then he asked permission to check the binder for older notations. The clerk slid it over and pointed to a rule that said deliveries needed 2 staff signatures. The binder held thick pages with names and room numbers, and some entries noted patient transfers to other wings. Calder skimmed recent weeks and then months, and nothing showed the initials LK, or any ring notes. He asked if the wing ever logged items that did not belong to current patients, and the clerk said rarely. She remembered a wedding band that fell through a bed frame on a weekend, and it took months to track. She said a therapist found it during a lift motor replacement, and the family cried when they got the call. The clerk shrugged and said the hospital felt like a moving chest of drawers, and odds and ends migrated forever. Calder walked to security with the pouch, and the guard on duty scanned the label with a handheld. The guard said the pouch style looked older, and the zip strip color was not used anymore. The guard printed the receipt and asked for a description, and Calder gave the engraving as clearly as possible. The guard searched a property database and found no ring tickets for the wing, and his search covered 2 years by default. Calder asked if there were archived losses in older years, and the guard said records before 2014 were scanned PDFs. The guard called upstairs and requested access to a shared drive, and the wait felt like a small eternity. Calder stood under the camera bubble and reviewed his shift notes, and the notes listed 4 dispatch times with addresses redacted here. He wrote a short line about a transfer from a rehab floor with a pleasant dog calendar, and he wrote another about a night custodian who kept a radio. None of the lines mentioned a ring, and none of the patients wore jewelry in obvious ways. He opened his phone gallery and checked the bench photo he took for restocking, and the timestamp matched their return to the bay. The ring did not appear in that picture, and the bench looked clean and dull. He wondered if the ring slid loose after the photo when the rig shuttered, and the thought did not settle his nerves. The guard waved him back and offered a chair, and they opened a folder of ripped black and white scans. One report flagged an incident in the East Wing, and the date read May 14 of 2010. The note said a patient property bag failed during a bed change, and a ring listed as L.K. went missing. The report said staff searched the room, and linen hampers were checked in central processing. A second note added that the family could not be reached, and a voicemail box stayed full for weeks. The case closed without resolution, and the scan ended with a faded stamp that looked handmade. Calder felt the small click that happens when separate lines meet, and the label suddenly seemed heavier than its weight. He asked if the room number was legible, and the guard zoomed until the pixels turned into blocks. The number looked like 212 or 217, and the wing layout had changed since then. The guard said maintenance might have an old map, and a shop supervisor kept binders in a cage downstairs. Calder thanked him, and he asked to make a quick copy of the scan for his crew file. The guard printed the page and stamped a copy line, and he urged Calder to keep things simple with the wing. On the loading dock, a housekeeper pushed a rolling cart, and she mentioned hearing about a ring on the radio. She said her aunt worked here years ago as a transporter, and her aunt remembered a family who asked about LK. The aunt thought LK stood for Lena Kovacs, and that name showed up on a donor plaque somewhere. The housekeeper stressed that it was just a memory, and people mixed up stories after long shifts. Calder thanked her and asked which plaque she meant, and she guessed it could be by the therapy gym. He made a note with a star, and he promised nothing beyond a respectful check. Maintenance loaned him a binder with a taped spine, and the old East Wing diagram showed rooms from 190 to 230. A paper tab marked a wall removal year in 2005, and the spaces had been reconfigured since that renovation. The diagram showed linen chutes and mechanical closets, and one chute lined up behind the current rehab gym. Calder compared the faded room to a modern corner, and the old room 212 would be near the therapy office. He felt the workable line appear, and it had more gears than luck. He thanked the supervisor and returned the binder, and he set off toward the gym. The therapy office had a bulletin board with service pins, and a small photo showed a woman in scrubs named Kovacs. A caption said she ran a staff fundraiser in 2011, and the photo looked like a copy of a copy. Calder asked the receptionist if Miss Kovacs still worked there, and the receptionist said she retired years ago. The receptionist checked a directory and found no current contact, and then she opened a drawer with old alumni notes. She found a folded program from a memorial tea, and the newsletter said, Lena Kovacs lost a husband early. The print used careful language, and it did not mention the ring or the initials. Calder felt a chill that did not belong to superstition, and he asked security if he could call the number on the old scan. The guard said the number probably died years ago, and he recommended the hospital volunteer office for family links. Calder went there and explained the situation, and he kept details minimal and careful. The volunteer coordinator listened and nodded, and then she showed him a book of donor inscriptions. She pointed at a plaque near the rehab gym, and the name said, Kovacs Family Therapy Garden with a small leaf icon. She said the family sometimes visited during late summer, and she could pass a message through a general email. Calder returned to the East Wing desk and asked again to log the ring, and he added the old report number on the form. The charge nurse read his notes and raised an eyebrow, and she asked whether this was a lost patient or a lost object. Calder answered it was certainly an object, and he was trying to avoid making anyone hurt again. She stared at the band through the plastic and then nodded, and she initialed the line for custody. She called linen services and requested a search of older chutes, and she asked maintenance about a recent vibration test nearby. She then told Calder she appreciated the thoroughness and she would add her number to the receipt. On his lunch break that arrived at almost noon, Calder called his partner from the shift and asked about the bench cushion. His partner said the cushion ripped months ago near the latch, and small things sometimes fell into that hollow void. He said he once lost a pen that rolled out 3 weeks later, and they both laughed about the gremlins. Calder asked if any hospital staff had borrowed their transport stretcher recently, and his partner said rehab used it during a power test yesterday. The partner said the rehab techs pushed the stretcher over a threshold that made the whole thing shudder. Calder pictured the ring jumping free inside the cushion, and the moment drew a simple line through time. He walked to biomedical engineering and asked about the rehab stretcher loan, and the tech on duty pulled an asset report. The report showed a loan to the East Wing therapy office, and the return time matched their arrival last night. The tech said the stretcher had a known rattle in the side rail, and small items could migrate if they slipped. Calder requested permission to inspect the rail, and the tech handed over a hex key with a cautious smile. He removed the end cap and tipped the rail, and a dust mix fell with a soft hiss. Nothing else emerged, and the ring hypothesis remained just that. And yet, it still felt reasonable. Calder tried laundry services next and asked whether a ring could travel from a chute to a truck and back. The supervisor said it happened rarely, and a ring could ride a torn bag to a cart and escape later. The supervisor said older chutes sometimes released surprises when motors kicked, and vibration made lost things walk. She said one time a pager chimed from a folded blanket, and everyone jumped because the model was ancient. She wrote down the ring details and promised to ask her staff, and she asked for the property receipt number. Calder thanked her and climbed the stairs because the elevator seemed suddenly crowded. A retired nurse named Myra arrived for a flu shot, and she recognized the old pouch design at the east desk. She said those pouches vanished after 2012, and she used to seal them with a blue strip. She looked at the initials and stopped, and she softly said Lena kept her maiden name for work. She remembered a shift when a patient requested a chaplain, and afterward a ring went missing from the bag. She said they turned the room upside down and found nothing, and she cried telling the family that week. She asked whether the ring was truly here now, and the charge nurse said it was in security as of this morning. Calder asked whether Myra could share a statement, and she agreed to write a short note with dates as best she could. Her handwriting looked steady for a long history, and she described a bed change and a linen swap. She recalled a code earlier that day in a nearby room, and equipment had moved through the hallway quickly. She said carts piled up while everyone managed the chaos, and the chute doors swung as orderlies cleared hampers. She noted that Lena worked that corridor and often stayed late, and she kept paperwork near the therapy office. Myra ended by saying the family did not push a complaint, and the grief felt huge enough already. Calder added the note to the property file, and he asked security to copy the PDF and the asset report. The guards stapled everything carefully and wrote a short chain of custody line, and then he called his supervisor. The supervisor arrived and listened without interruption, and he nodded at each small connective piece. He said it sounded plausible that the ring traveled by linen or by stretcher rail, and the return timing fit. He asked whether anyone had reached the Kovacs family, and the volunteer office answered that a general email was sent. He decided the ring should be placed with the wing director for now, and then returned when the family responded. Calder walked the ring to the wing director with the charge nurse, and the director unlocked a small safe by the desk. The director read the file twice and looked out at the therapy gym, and he seemed to count years without words. He thanked Calder for not turning this into a story beyond the facts, and he said the path felt honest. He said sometimes the building kept tiny traps from old renovations, and objects slid back into daylight when ready. He placed the ring pouch on a velvet pad, and he wrote the time and his name with a careful hand. He said they would hold the ring in the wing, and they would make sure the right people heard. That afternoon, a volunteer returned with a printed email, and the message contained a phone number that still worked. The director asked Calder to stay as a witness, and they called the number on speaker in a quiet office. A woman answered and identified herself as Mira, and she said she was Lena's niece by marriage. She listened to the summary and asked a few precise questions, and her voice shook on the second. She said her aunt still wore a thin band and a chain, and this sounded like her husband's original ring. She said the family visited the garden plaque every May, and they never stopped asking about a lost ring. They met in a neutral conference room with frosted glass, and the director set the pouch on the table. Mira brought a small photo from 2010, and the ring in the picture looked like the one in the pouch. She asked to hold it for a moment, and then she breathed as if she had been underwater too long. She pointed to a tiny scratch on the inner edge, and it matched a bike fall from their early years together. She explained that the initials were his and hers, and the date marked the wedding by a justice in a quiet office. She thanked the room and said she did not want a ceremony, and she was just grateful for care. Calder signed the witness line and pushed the pen toward the director, and the moment felt weightless and plain. Mira asked whether anyone would mind if she visited the therapy garden, and the director offered to walk her there. She asked if the ring could remain with the wing for a little while, and she wanted to place flowers first. The director said the wing would be honored, and he promised to contact her if any details surfaced later. Calder stood back and watched the distance between grief and closure collapse, and it looked like a hallway finally cleared. He nodded to the charge nurse and pocketed his notebook, and he promised to replace the bench cushions soon. 2 days later, the linen supervisor called Calder and said a tech found a torn seam in the stretcher cover. The tear ran along a hidden edge that opened under vibration, and small things could hide there without notice. The tech also found a coin lodged deep inside, and its date hit the same era noted in the file. The supervisor said this was not proof of the ring path, and it felt like a friendly witness. Calder took a picture of the seam and added it to the binder, and he logged the maintenance request for replacement. The small chain of custody now included the rail and the cover, and the line grew stronger without pretending certainty. The wing director arranged a short gathering by the therapy garden, and a few staff who remembered Lena came by. They set a small card that said, "Returned to the East Wing," and they left space for a family decision. Mira arrived with her 2 cousins and a bouquet, and she asked if she could speak to the gathered staff. She thanked everyone for treating the story with hands open, and she said the ring could stay displayed for 1 week. After that week, she would take it home, and she would bring it back every May as a quiet practice. People nodded because the balance felt right, and the garden bench caught the late light gently. Calder watched from the edge with his coffee, and he remembered the pen that tapped the bench before he saw the ring. He thought about the way buildings hold on to things, and how people read meaning into dust and echo. He thought about dispatch logs that look cold until someone traces them, and then the script becomes a real day. He considered the lines that join strangers into an honest arc, and he respected each break where evidence speaks. The ring did not prove fate, and it did prove persistence, and it showed that care can be methodical. He left the garden before the applause faded, and he headed for the bay to start another shift. On his next overnight run, he noticed the new bench cushion, and it no longer swallowed dropped pens into hiding. He kept his notebook on the dash and wrote a line about the East Wing, and he kept the words simple. He wrote that a ring once traveled the hospital like a seed on wind, and the wind finally stopped here. He wrote that people made that stop happen by checking maps and calling quietly, and by not rushing a story. He wrote that the wing felt different now, and the difference came from patience more than any grand event. He closed the book and turned on the radio, and the night answered with the ordinary sound of work. Weeks later, the director sent a copy of a small framed note, and it now sat by the garden plaque. The note stated that a staff family recovered a long-missing ring, and it had rested here for a time. It stated that the return involved a paramedic, a clerk, a guard, a supervisor, and a retired nurse. It added that the file included a torn stretcher cover and a scan dated May 14 of 2010. It invited no legend and made no claim beyond the chain of quotes and receipts, and it felt right that way. Calder clipped the note into a shift binder and smiled, and then he got called out for a routine transfer. On the way past the east wing doors, he slowed and looked in, and the desk lamp made the binder glow. The charge nurse raised a hand without words, and the unit seemed calm in the bright noon. He thought again about how evidence moves on small wheels and how the best stories stay quiet when finished. He considered how many families carry unclosed lines and how sometimes a lost object can stitch one shut. He knew this ring did not solve grief, and it gave shape to a memory that had gone thin with years. He swung the rig into the daylight and felt the road through the wheel, and the city rolled forward like usual. Months later, he learned that Mira returned each May with flowers, and she touched the glass with the ring inside. The volunteer office kept the file updated in a narrow drawer, and the drawer label read East Wing Recoveries. Security replaced the camera bubble over the bay and kept the old unit for parts, and they joked about relics. The maintenance supervisor finally tossed the torn cover after documenting it, and he felt oddly proud of the careful record. The hospital moved through another winter without big headlines, and the garden kept the same soft wind under the windows. Calder kept working nights and never chased mention, and the crew understood without any speech at all. He still told new hires one short version during checkout, and he kept the details clear of romance. He said a ring with initials LK turned up under a bench after a stretcher loan, and the label named this wing. He said the date on the old report matched the engraving, and the linen path explained the long delay. He said good records and patient calls made the circle close, and that promise is why they log everything. He said someone cried without making a scene, and that is how truth usually presents itself at work. Then he pointed to the property pouch drawer and the fresh bench cushion, and he told them to check twice. Calder visited the garden once more after a busy night, and he stood alone before the building woke completely. He watched sun slide across the plaque letters until the leaf icon warmed, and the quiet felt unearned and good. He thought of how small choices build bridges that do not announce themselves, and then one step reveals the span. He remembered a retired nurse who wrote a careful line and a housekeeper who shared a family guess. He remembered a guard who kept files neat and a director who knew not to fill silence. He placed his palm on the cool railing and chose no grand meaning, and he simply wished everyone a gentle day. The ring returned to this hospital wing by documented steps, and the steps were ordinary and human and steady. The story did not need a mystery beyond time and movement, and it showed how rooms keep modest promises. He considered that a bench cushion, a torn cover, and a faded scan can hold a family together again. He thought that is enough for any place built to heal, and he walked back to the bay without speaking. He started the rig and checked the lights, and the reflections blinked across the wet asphalt. He breathed, then he rolled toward the morning traffic, and the work met him with the same quiet weight. The burning house on Ridge Road, Tennessee. Smoke showed over the folded hills west of Johnson City after sundown, a thin gray ribbon flattening under a cooling sky. Drivers slowed along Ridge Road and watched a single roofline lose its shape behind moving haze. Dispatch logs captured the first report at 1920, citing flames visible through trees near a narrow bend. The caller reportedly could not confirm people inside, only that the windows looked black and the yard was empty. Ethan Ward was 41, a volunteer firefighter from Jonesboro, driving home after a hardware errand when he saw the smoke. He slowed near the ridge crest and turned onto the gravel turnout by habit learned during brush seasons. His purpose that evening was practical and local, to check if anyone needed water or a ride toward the highway. Archive notes state he kept a wool blanket and a pry bar in his truck, a routine drawn from winter wrecks. He radioed county dispatch using a handheld set he carried off duty, requesting confirmation of the address that no one actually named. Mara Collins was 33. A home health nurse finishing a medication check near Telford, returning toward the city with an empty cooler. Her route crossed Ridge Road because traffic on the highway moved strangely that week after resurfacing work. She saw the same gray band, then a brighter pulse from a deeper pocket of trees cut into the slope. State records list her as licensed since 2011 with no disciplinary marks and multiple rural assignments. She later told deputies she stopped because the color shifted from brush to structure, a difference she recognized from farm incidents. Deputy Luis Benton was 37, a patrol deputy with Washington County, answering a fire assist call relayed across channels after neighboring units were engaged. His stated purpose was scene safety and initial perimeter control while county engines rerouted from a barn alarm. According to dispatch logs, he cleared a traffic complaint near Boones Creek and set lights before the last ridge curve. His cruiser camera reportedly caught brief reflections on roadside mailboxes, then nothing but drifting particulate like fine dust. Some locals claimed the camera angle missed the driveway entirely, though investigators never confirmed a technical fault. The structure sat back from the road behind mature pines, a single-story rectangle with a shallow porch and a tin roof. County appraisal data listed it as built in the late 1970s with a detached shed and a shallow well. Records conflict on whether the electric service was active because one entry shows a delinquent account while another shows a recent payment. Ethan parked facing out and grabbed his pry bar, calling toward the porch that carried 2 chairs and a plastic crate. He reported hearing a low crack inside, not like a collapse, more like resinous boards reacting to heat across tight nails. Mara set her cooler on the driveway gravel and tried the front knob, which felt warm but not dangerous, then swung inward. She called out for anyone home and moved past the door line, stopping at a short hall choked with thin smoke. Ethan followed her with the blanket and a small flashlight, and they worked right first toward a room with stacked bins. County file from 2009 described prior code concerns about storage and blocked egress at this parcel, though no fines were listed. Investigators never confirmed whether those recommendations were addressed because 2 separate inspections show conflicting completion notes. Inside the bins were magazines and folded tarps, plus canning jars labeled with masking tape and dates that read last winter. The floor showed fresh sweeping lines, a detail noted in archived notes because the house otherwise felt unused. Ethan checked the window latch and found it painted shut, then cracked the frame with the pry bar to vent smoke. Mara pointed left toward a glow against a closed door. Not bright, just persistent, like heat collecting behind a thin barrier. They backed out to avoid pulling air through the hallway and feeding what had not yet broken free. Deputy Benton reached the turnout and cut his siren, then walked in with a flashlight and a disposable mask kept in his vest. He asked about occupants, utilities, and any hazards like cylinders or stored fuel, and Ethan gave short answers while scanning the tree line. State records showed a recent transfer of the property to a holding company with a Johnson City mailbox and no listed tenant. Some locals claimed a handyman stayed there between small jobs, sleeping on a cot and keeping tools in the shed. Investigators never confirmed his name, and records conflict on whether a temporary occupancy permit existed that season. Engines from Gray and Jonesboro turned onto Ridge Road within minutes, rerouted by radio after the barn alarm cleared false. The pump operator laid supply down the drive, while another crew stretched a line to the porch and checked the sill for flame. Ethan briefed the arriving lieutenant and stepped aside, then offered to pull a secondary line toward the shed if commanded. Dispatch logs show a note at 1931 about low water at the nearest hydrant, prompting a tender request from a neighboring district. The lieutenant reportedly decided on a quick interior search while the line charged, prioritizing rooms closest to the visible glow. Mara waited near the turnout and watched the tree line move against a fuse light, noticing a vehicle half hidden beyond the shed. She told Deputy Benton, and they walked over, finding an older sedan settled into grass with mildew on the windows and a flat tire. The plates returned to a woman from Unicoi, suspended for insurance issues, according to a quick check that night. Records conflict on whether the vehicle was recently driven because the engine bay felt cool, but the cabin held faint cigarette odor. Some locals claimed a similar car parked there on prior evenings, seen from the ridge during dog walks before dark. Inside the house, the quick search found no one in the main rooms, only a closed utility closet with a locked handle. The lieutenant ordered the door forced, and a cloud of hot vapor cleared into the hallway, carrying a stronger smell like adhesive. Investigators later wrote that a portable heater sat on a shelf near stacked cardboard close to a wall outlet with a cracked face. State records show a recall notice for similar units early that year, though purchase data for this property never surfaced. The pattern of heat reportedly suggested slow smolder transitioning toward open flame, not an immediate flash. The shed added a second puzzle because someone stored 2 blue drums, both labeled as waste oil with dates from spring. Deputy Benton photographed faint boot marks on the dusty floor, angled toward a pegboard with empty hooks and a missing hammer. Archived notes mention a recent report of tool thefts along rural roads, although the described method involved pried barn doors, not sheds. Mara stood back and pointed out a shallow trench leading from the shed corner toward a low spot near the pines. Investigators never confirmed whether it carried runoff from the drums, though soil samples reportedly showed hydrocarbons below threshold levels. Engines established flow, and crews cooled the hallway while ventilation fans pushed smoke through the cut window frames. The roof held, then flexed as trapped heat moved, releasing a rush that sounded like wind where no wind existed. Ethan helped pull debris into the yard and stacked it away from the porch, watching for char that could reignite in dry grass. The lieutenant asked for a final pass with the thermal camera, which showed a stubborn hot line behind the closet adjacent to old shelving. Records conflict on whether wiring upgrades ever reached this wall because the permit file stops at rough inspection. As operations slowed, a neighbor walked up from the lower bend, a retired teacher who kept notes on local history for weekend talks. He told Deputy Benton the house once belonged to a family that left during the housing slump, then rented to short-term occupants. He said a man with a gray cap visited that week carrying a tool bag and a stack of envelopes clipped together. Some locals claimed the envelopes were rent notices, while others said they looked like county flyers about brush cleanup. Investigators never confirmed either, and no envelopes were found in the debris or the nearby ditch. A second neighbor recalled hearing a truck on Ridge Road before dusk, stopping briefly near the turnout where Ethan later parked. Dispatch logs include a time-stamped note about a call from another ridge, mentioning a revving sound and a quick departure downhill. State records contain no traffic stop matching that description because cruisers were occupied with the barn alarm and a separate welfare check. Archived notes suggest similar patterns at vacant structures during cold snaps, when heaters appear without paperwork and vanish after damage. The pattern reportedly motivated patrol sweeps that winter, although budget sheets show reduced overtime during that quarter. When investigators sifted the hallway, they found 2 door keys fused together near the closet, an odd pairing for such a narrow space. Ethan told them he had not seen a ring by the entry table, only scattered coins and a cracked picture frame. Mara remembered a faint outline on the wall where something once hung, possibly a calendar, possibly a routing sheet for maintenance visits. Records conflict on whether a property manager ever posted documents inside rentals because policies changed when ownership moved to holding companies. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the fused keys, though measurements matched standard blanks used across the county. The final report described the cause as undetermined, with contributing factors tied to portable heat and compromised outlets along the interior wall. It noted the absence of occupants and the lack of personal clothing in closets, plus stacked bins suggesting storage rather than residence. State records later updated the parcel as unsafe, recommending fencing and watch patrols during evenings when traffic thins across the ridge. Some locals claimed they saw a single light in the shed days after the fire, a small square glow that disappeared when trucks approached. Investigators never confirmed that detail, and camera coverage shows only drifting night insects reflecting a weak beam. Months later, the sedan was towed, the shed locks replaced, and the house boarded with standard plywood stencil marks facing the road. Archived notes remark that Ethan returned twice on his own time to check for trespass, finding only raccoon prints and windblown ash. Mara crossed the ridge less often after shifting routes, but she kept a map pin on her phone to remember the turnoff. Records conflict on whether the holding company renewed insurance because one policy number shows a cancellation while another appears active with missing dates. The parcel remains listed as improved rural, awaiting decisions that reportedly stalled during meetings held without posted minutes. What happened inside the hour before smoke rose over the hills remains a narrowing field of possibilities tested against stubborn gaps. The heater could have crept against cardboard, or an unseen splice could have heated behind shelving where old nails pierced brittle insulation. A visitor might have plugged something into the cracked outlet, then left, believing the glow would settle as temperatures dropped. Investigators never confirmed a timeline inside that closet, and the county file from 2009 ends before the relevant changes. Some locals claimed the house never wanted people, yet the official record only shows heat, fuel, oxygen, and a door that stuck. The stories. Ranger Station Ledger flagged a missing permit at dawn. At first light, the Ranger Station Ledger spat out an alert that one backcountry permit number did not reconcile with issued copies. The overnight dispatcher circled the entry in red marker and wrote missing, which was the only word nobody wanted to see. Latham Reyes was 39 and worked as a field ranger who managed trailheads, radios, and the old metal key cabinet. He clocked in early, poured coffee into a chipped mug, then read the ledger twice and felt the room shrink. The permit number matched a reservation tied to a solo hiker who had not checked out by yesterday's sunset. The name read Tomas Halper, age 37, and the emergency contact line ended with no answer recorded. The station had a routine for this exact situation, which looked simple on paper and complicated in real life. He pulled the overnight radio log and the reservation printouts, then called the county dispatch desk for archived calls. The dispatcher on duty answered with a clipped voice and confirmed one brief call near dusk from a nearby pullout. The call dropped before the location pinged twice, so they logged it as incomplete. The park sat in a mountain chain that people photographed from a highway turnout that smelled like hot brakes in summer. Locals said the place had thin borders where trails overlapped with old timber tracks and forgotten mining access roads. Latham set a simple goal for the day, which was to verify whether Tomas walked out early and skipped the desk. Some hikers did that, and he hated how often it fooled staff into sounding alarms. He decided to check cameras at the east exit and the service road past the old quarry first. He taped the ledger alert to his clipboard, added radio times from the night log, then headed for the truck with a paper map. A gray Subaru with mud caked behind the plates sat in the day lot under a fading trailhead sign. The plate number matched the permit file, so the vehicle check became the trigger that changed the plan entirely. His voice on the radio stayed steady, but he felt that familiar pressure behind the eyes that always came with missing cars. The last ranger who ignored a parked car overnight still had nightmares about the aftermath that followed. Latham walked a slow circle around the Subaru and took photos of the interior through the windows. He counted a blue windbreaker, a gas station coffee cup, a folded receipt, and an orange wrapper with the corner torn off. He logged the items in his notes and called the plate to the county line to confirm registration. The response came back clean, with a mailing address to a city 2 hours away and no active warrants. Two backpackers in their late 20s shuffled by and looked at the Subaru like it might answer a question. The woman spoke first and said they passed a guy at the junction near the ridge after a late climb. She described a man with a close beard, a faded cap, and a limp that looked like a boot rubbing wrong. She added that he asked about the shortcut to the lake, which did not exist, then waved and kept moving. The guy with her nodded, then said the man had a new pack that made his shoulders ride up like he was not used to it. Witness statements always came salted with memory gaps, yet both details felt real in a way that mattered. Latham thanked them, wrote their names and numbers, then reminded them to check out at the station before they left town. He pulled the dash cam card from the station truck used on the evening loop and plugged it into the office laptop. The last loop showed nothing on the service road, then a fragment of taillights near the quarry gate at gray dusk. The timestamp matched the brief call window from dispatch, which made his coffee taste like metal. He froze the frame where the taillights blinked and magnified the shot until the pixels bled and swam. The shape of the car looked like a small pickup with a roof rack, which did not match the Subaru in the lot. He saved the frame, printed it, and stapled it to the ledger alert for a later look. He called the quarry foreman on the number posted by the locked gate, then asked whether any crews ran equipment after hours. The foreman swore nothing moved, then said the gate lock had a stiff shackle that hated winter, which did not help much. A call came in from the store in the valley, where hikers bought dehydrated chili and overpriced fuel canisters in bright colors. The clerk said she recognized the name from the morning before and remembered that he used a prepaid card with a scratched strip. She mentioned he bought a paper map and a plastic whistle, then asked if everything was all right, which Latham did not answer directly. He requested the receipt copy and any camera footage that covered the register and door. The clerk said the owner saved footage for 2 weeks as a shoplifting deterrent, so she would print stills from around 9:15. The mention of a prepaid card added a wrinkle that he did not like, because it cut down searchable paper trails by a lot. He wrote it down anyway, then underlined it twice and moved on. He drove to the ridge trailhead and checked the kiosk log where people still wrote their plans with dull pencils. The entry for Tomas said out on Saturday, back by Sunday, route Circle Lake counterclockwise, camp night 1 near inlet. The loop around the lake had 4 clear stream crossings and 2 spots where cairns tempted new hikers into old fire scars. He looked for additional notes and found a faint scrawl that read, "Saw tent near logjam after dark," which lacked a dateline. He took a photo, then turned to the ridge where the wind pushed low clouds across a face that liked to break ankles. He walked the first mile with his radio on scan and found fresh boot prints that veered onto the quarry track despite a closed sign. The prints were deep on the outer heel, which matched the reported limp, and the spacing suggested someone who favored the right leg. The quarry track dropped behind fir trees and came out near a rusted gate with a battered lock that still hung closed. A torn strip of fabric in a dull blue shade clung to a stump where a person might squeeze past the hinge. He bagged the strip, wrote the time, then looked up to see crows cross low and fast like bad messengers. He followed the track to a flat where water pooled in old ruts and reflected a sky that never looked friendly in March. A mound of gravel showed fresh tire marks with an odd zigzag that looked like someone learning a clutch by feel. He crouched and ran a finger along the rut wall and felt dust that had not settled into crust, which put the timing close. The quarry foreman had denied any late activity, so the marks likely tied to whoever drove near the gate at dusk. He shot photos, measured the width with a broken stick and a tape, then plotted the line on his map. Back at the station, he spread the notes, photos, and the printed taillights frame across a desk that had a gouge shaped like Idaho. He listened to the archive dispatch call again, which captured a short, breathy voice, saying quick words that fractured with static. The caller had said something that sounded like lost permit or lost person, then a muffled clack, and the line fell quiet. He played the clip 5 times and wrote down 2 interpretations with a question mark, which was the style the supervisor liked. The radio log from hikers listed a second-hand report from a fisherman who heard a whistle near the inlet after dusk. The fisherman had used a cheap handheld radio with a weak battery, so the recording lived as a line of text and not a voice. That was fine, because the whistle purchase from the Valley store had already planted itself in his mind as a breadcrumb. Late morning brought a small-town police officer named Mara Key, who handled the highway stretch that touched the park border. She was 33 and worked patrol shifts that crossed into everything that did not fit elsewhere. She parked by the Subaru and walked up with a notepad and a friendly face that could turn sharp in a second. They stood by the hood and traded notes that barely needed full sentences after years of joint calls. She said the highway turnout camera caught a gray pickup with a roof rack at 1842, heading toward the quarry. She added that a volunteer firefighter reported an unusual truck bed loaded with tarps after 9 near the county line. Latham held up the taillight's print and said the shape tracked with what she had. She nodded, then asked whether the missing permit might actually be a duplicate number from a previous season. He blinked once, then went very quiet because that question hit a different nerve. Permit numbers rolled over every winter long before the system went digital, and some older blocks had gaps and repeats. The ledger printed the flag because the manual book showed the number as issued to a different name in late fall. He dug into the archive cabinet that breathed dust and pine and pulled the worn book from the shelf, marked 98. The ink on the page showed the same number assigned to a group from a climbing club from a city 3 hours west. The lead name read Rayan Cade, age 32, and a phone number that matched a defunct area code now recycled. He compared the handwriting from both permit slips and saw the same loop on the number 4 in the dateline. That did not make sense until he looked at the clerk's signature, which matched a retired staffer who kept garage sales every summer. He wrote down the name and the year in words so the report would not kick back for formatting later. He stepped outside and called the retired clerk on a personal number found in an old staff tree near the copier. The woman sounded bright and happy to hear a ranger voice, then quieted when he explained the duplicate number issue. She said she used to pre-write permits during busy seasons to speed lines, then fill names in with a light touch. She added that some pads got stored in a desk drawer after winter changeover and might have ended up in the surplus box. That surplus box sometimes went to the annual trailer sale with old radios and busted snowshoes for pocket change. He felt his throat go dry and asked whether any blank slips could be floating in the world with the seal already stamped. She said it was possible, then apologized and said nobody had asked about that practice since 1998 ended. He thanked her gently and wrote a note for the supervisor that would not make anyone cheerful. The store clerk sent stills that showed Tomas at the counter holding a paper map in a stiff hand with a white bandage. The timestamp read 9/12, which lined up with when the trailhead sign-in sheet filled up. A second still showed a man behind him wearing a quarry company cap who bought batteries and jerky. That detail landed like a small stone in a bigger pond because of the quarry track prints and the taillights frame. Latham called the quarry foreman again and asked to see the shift roster for the past 2 days. The foreman sighed and said he would email a screenshot since office rules required written requests for full copies. The screenshot arrived with smudged names and a note about 2 contractors hired short-term for cleanup after heavy rain. One contractor matched the cap logo from the still, which felt like a door creaking open after a stubborn winter. Latham and Officer Key drove to the quarry safety office, which smelled like coffee and oil and a fight nobody wanted. The foreman met them with a clipboard and a face that said he hated unexpected questions on a weekday. Key kept her voice friendly and asked to speak with the contractor who wore the cap with the same faded stitch. The foreman said the man was named Vicente Rowe, age 36, who lived in a rented room above the tire shop. He added that Rowe had left early the previous night because a radiator hose blew near the county line. Key asked to see the truck, and the foreman pointed to a gray pickup with a rack and tarps bunched in back. The bed still held a coil of new rope, a rusted shovel, and a muddy cooler that smelled like lake water and gasoline. Latham felt that metallic taste again, which was never a sign of a good afternoon ahead. Rowe arrived from the far lot with hands raised and a look that said he already knew why they were here. He said he had filed a work order for the hose, which they confirmed with a carbon sheet and a phone photo. Key asked whether he had been near the lake after dark, and he said he left the quarry road to test the hose under load. He added that he pulled aside at the turnout near the inlet and heard a whistle that made him wonder about a prank. He did not call anyone because his phone was dead after streaming music during cleanup, which landed badly but not impossibly. He said he saw a small tent by the logjam and a lantern glow. Then a figure waved and yelled something about a permit. Key wrote it down and asked for permission to look inside the cooler, which Rowe granted with a shrug and a steady jaw. Inside lay 2 empty water jugs, a crumpled fuel canister sleeve, and a plastic whistle in an unopened bag from the Valley store. Back at the station, Latham laid the whistle sleeve next to the store receipt copy and saw a mismatch in barcode digits. The sleeve in the cooler matched an older shipment code that the store had sold out months ago during a discount run. That meant the whistle in the cooler likely came from a different source than the one Tomas bought at 9/12. He looked again at the still where Tomas held the map with the bandaged hand and noticed a line of dried mud on the cuff. The mud looked pale and powdery, which matched the quarry fill used to stabilize the service road after storms. He wrote a timeline that pinned Tomas at the store, then likely at the quarry road, and finally near the inlet after dusk. He wrote a parallel line for Rowe that put him at the quarry, then on the same road, then near the inlet while testing a repair. The lines felt too neat until he added the duplicate permit issue that now seemed like a hinge rather than a footnote. He dug into the city address on file for Tomas and found a rental building with mailboxes that had newer locks installed last winter. The property manager answered with the cheerful speed of someone who wanted a clean day and already knew it was lost. She said a man with that name had paid cash, kept to himself, and left 2 weeks early with no forwarding note. She also said a different name had appeared on a delivery label once, which the courier mentioned when buzzing the wrong unit. The alternate name sounded familiar, and it clicked only when he reopened the 1998 ledger page. It matched the lead from the old climbing club permit, which tied the duplicate number to a person who should have aged out by now. The detail did not mean they were the same person, but it did mean someone liked to reuse names tied to old paper. Officer Key ran the alternate name through an old case index that kept records of search and rescue incidents on paper and microfilm. A report from 2 winters back described a fake distress call at the same inlet that lured volunteers into a risky night crossing. The caller used a prepaid phone and a different name, yet the voice transcription carried similar clipped phrasing and rushed breaths. The motive at the time seemed like a cruel prank, and nobody had linked it to anything tangible after the snow melted. Latham rechecked the gap between the whistle report and the dropped call and found a sliver where a person could move a short distance. He called the firefighter, who reported the unusual truck bed, and asked whether the tarps had looked wet or pulled tight. The firefighter said the tarps were tied tidy and dry, then added that the driver waved like a man who wanted to be seen. Afternoon shadows drew long, so they hiked to the inlet with a drone from the county that tracked heat signatures. The drone skimmed treetops and sent back images of the logjam, the bank, and the flat near the old survey marker. No body, no fresh campsite, just flattened grass near the logjam where a tent might have stood during a short decoy. They found 2 sets of prints, one deep on the right heel and one narrower with an even stride that cut toward the quarry track. Near the waterline, he found a paper map folded in a way he recognized from the still, which made his chest go tight. The map held a smear of pale mud and a faint X near the old prospector's trail that dead-ended at a slide. He bagged the map and stared at the X until it felt like it stared back, then marked the spot on his own copy. The slide path opened into a shallow cut with wooden forms left from a never-finished footbridge project funded in 2005. He followed the forms until he reached a square of ground tamped hard as a table near a tree with a scar. The earth felt too tidy for random hikers, and the tree scar had fresh resin that caught light in a clean yellow bead. He brushed aside pine duff and found a buried plastic box that held a stack of old permit slips with the seal already stamped. The slips matched the retired clerk's pre-written style, and several had Rancade typed in a cheap courier font. A second stack carried blank lines and a stamp pad spot like a kit for people who wanted official-looking paper for a plan. He felt a chill that did not come from wind, then called Key over and photographed the box from 3 angles. The twist revealed itself slowly, as if embarrassed to be simple after such a day of layered rumors and tire marks. Someone had staged a missing hiker using a duplicated permit number and a prepaid trail of receipts to trigger a standard response. The purpose was not to vanish, but to bait a small law enforcement swarm toward the lake while a second person moved cargo from the quarry. The zigzag tire marks in the gravel now read like a practice route for a heavy load that needed a quiet window. The fisherman's whistle and the tent glow created a cautious pause in anyone tempted to check the inlet on foot. The taillights near dusk were a partner vehicle that pulled close to the logjam, then backed out during the start of the false search. The target was not a person, but scrap copper and tools stored in a locked shed near the service road past the old quarry. They found the shed lock sliced clean with a battery saw when they returned with the foreman and a bolt cutter key. The inventory list taped inside showed spools of copper wire and fuel additives that had resale value in cash-only salvage yards. The contractor truck bed dimensions matched the load footprint on the dusty floor, and a partial shoe print matched the even stride near the inlet. The limp prints belonged to whoever wore a new boot wrong, which now felt like another layer for misdirection rather than a true injury. When confronted, Rowe did not fold, but the quiet employee who ran the tire shop room rentals gave a statement. He said Rowe met a man who matched Tomas in the parking lot and moved tarps between vehicles near sunset. He added that Rowe left after 9 with the bed loaded to the rails, which aligned with the firefighter observation with uncomfortable precision. The county prosecutor would need clean evidence, so they worked careful and slow to gather the chain. The paper box of pre-written permits became a centerpiece, since it explained how the ledger flag could be predicted in advance. The duplicate number drew attention at dawn by design, which pulled eyes away from the road where cargo rolled past a gate. The prepaid receipt at the Valley store placed a decoy at a predictable time, which witnesses could later repeat with conviction. The dropped call created a sympathetic recording in the archive that every incident review would elevate in urgency. The taillights in the dash cam and the turnout camera filled the gaps with enough glow to animate a story that felt real. None of it solved every moment, yet together it built a scaffold sturdy enough for charges that did not fall apart. They never found a body by the inlet, which fit the theory that nobody had been in true danger that night. A week later, a different store camera captured Tomas in a neighboring county buying a tire patch kit with a clean, unbandaged hand. The clip went into the case file under reportedly cited, along with a printout of the copper sales ledger from a salvage yard off the highway. Rowe took a short plea on theft and tampering with evidence, which irritated people who liked long answers. The paperwork on the duplicate permits triggered a policy change that barred pre-writing anything since 2021 onward. The retired clerk cried in the parking lot when she learned her old shortcuts had fed a scam, then hugged Latham like a nephew. He told her people adapt to pressures they do not design, and the fix mattered more than the blame. When the Subaru finally left the lot on a tow, the trailhead looked as ordinary as a grocery aisle on a Tuesday. Officer Key stood with her hands in her jacket and watched the tow lights climb the hill toward the highway. She said the simplest cons always hide in systems that run on habit and paperwork. Then she smiled without much humor. Latham looked at the ridge where the wind never ran out, then at the ledger that still sat on the desk. He thought about the whistle and the map and the soft faith people place in official stamps and good intentions. Later, he locked the station, and the rafters creaked in the cool like an old house learning a new rule. He drove past the turnout and looked once at the lake, which held its secrets with the stubborn patience of cold water and granite. He told himself they had not solved every detail, but they had nudged the pattern toward daylight, which was enough for now. The vanishing trail crew of Glacier Bay. In early summer of 2019, a 3-person trail crew sailed from Bartlett Cove toward a maintenance site beyond Tidal Inlet. Their assignment sounded routine, though the weather showed unsettled fronts rolling off icy strait with choppy swell and low gray ceilings. According to dispatch logs kept at Gustavus, the supervisor signed out a skiff, a radio, and a laminated route sheet. By evening, the radio stayed quiet, and the cove slip remained open where their skiff usually tied after day runs. Park staff noted the silence, then logged a late return without escalation, since crews sometimes bivouacked on gravel bars when fog thickened. The crew leader was Mark Hilliard, 42, a backcountry ranger tasked with coordinating seasonal trail work near the outer bays. He reportedly knew the coves and embayments from years of kayak patrols and small engine repair during rough spring openings. The second was Dana Ruiz, 29, a seasonal laborer hired from Juneau who handled saw work and minor bridge decking. The third was Chris Lawton, 34, a contractor from Sitka brought in to evaluate 3 washed-out footlogs after late snowmelt. Their stated purpose, according to state records, was clearing windfall and flagging a reroute above a recurring slide near Geikie Inlet. Before they left, archived notes mentioned barometer readings that fell through midday while the outer channels carried a long northwest swell. The skiff carried fuel for 2 days, spare plugs, and a small tarp shelter along with first aid and food. Radios were checked on channel 16, then switched to a park channel listed on the route sheet, which later drew attention. A maintenance tech recalled a faint transmission near mid-afternoon that cut off mid-word, which investigators never confirmed due to static. That fragment became the last possible voice contact tied to the listed call signs for the team. A search began the next morning after the boathouse recorded another empty slip and a duplicate late return entry. 2 rangers motored north with binoculars, while another ranger canvassed the shoreline pullouts toward Latuya side creeks. Some locals claimed the fog held so low that boats could not safely round a point past Blue Mouse, yet the forecast suggested clearing. Records conflict on whether a small craft advisory persisted inside the bay, since buoy readings at the entrance were intermittent. That uncertainty complicated estimates about how far a light skiff could reasonably travel before fuel became a constraint. Investigators mapped likely routes using the laminated sheet, which showed intended stops at two trailheads reachable at higher tides. The tides reportedly ran moderate, with an afternoon flood that might have pulled drift along shoals beside rocky shelves. The team expected to camp if work ran past daylight, and their kit included a compact stove and reflective line for food hangs. When crews bivouac, standard practice is a radio check by nightfall, which the supervisor marked as missed without immediate alarm. That detail later drew criticism from an internal review about staggered check times during early season operations. By day 3, aviation assets from Juneau conducted low passes along beaches where fresh bear tracks crisscrossed stranded kelp. They found no shelter remains, no new fire rings, and no visible sawdust piles around down spruce trunks. A canvas tool roll surfaced near a cut bank east of Reed Inlet, where cedar shims rattled inside when shaken. The roll matched a brand issued to contractors, though serial numbers had worn smooth after seasons of wet handling. Photographs entered into a county file from 2009 showed similar rolls, which helped at least narrow provenance despite missing initials. Divers searched a narrow cove where eddies collect logs and fuel cans during strong flood cycles. Visibility was poor, and the kelp line braided around jagged rock, though one diver very carefully traced anchor rope scars. A fragment of polypropylene line surfaced with frayed ends, which one report suggested looked cut by abrasion rather than a blade. That interpretation remained tentative, and investigators never confirmed a definitive source, given the number of skiffs working the bay that month. The fragment went into evidence with salt still weeping from its fibers under the station heater. An engine mechanic reviewed maintenance logs and found the assigned outboard had a recent impeller change and a clean carburetor bowl. Fuel samples from the boathouse tank tested normal, matching dye standards from vendor shipments logged in late May. A spare pull cord remained coiled in the skiff locker, which mattered only if the original cord failed during a stall. Some locals claimed a finicky kill switch on older housings sometimes tripped when gear snagged lanyards, though the assigned model used a firm clip. The review marked that risk as low, while the absence of the skiff kept all mechanical theories hypothetical. Witness interviews in Gustavus produced 2 partial sightings near mid-afternoon on the departure day. A charter captain remembered a small skiff crossing his wake beyond rushing tide chop with 3 figures huddled tight behind the console. A wildlife photographer reported seeing a tarp flash near a gravel bar as fog pressed in, which could have been a shelter or a sail. Investigators never confirmed either sighting, and times in both statements drifted by nearly an hour when compared against GPS tracks. The gap left a narrow window where the team could have diverted toward a lower beach to ride out visibility. Searchers found a tied bundle of flagging tape and a small notebook wedged inside drift farther north than planners expected. The notebook pages were swollen, and only 2 lines remained legible under a gentle light passed across the pulp. One line mentioned reroute stakes on a slope where runoff undercut black soil above exposed roots. The second line listed an intended return by last light, conditional on fog break, which tracked with the route sheet initialed by the supervisor. Rainwater had blurred the date, though the hand looked like Hilliard's based on earlier training rosters. A separate thread emerged when a weather station east of the bay logged a brief wind reversal just after local dusk. Analysts suggested a squall line briefly bent around coastal contours, which can push light craft toward shoals that sit quieter under normal flow. That pattern reportedly funnels drift into coves that lack safe holding ground, and engines sometimes cavitate when kelp tangles the intake. If the crew anchored close to shore for shelter, the reversal might have swung the skiff into rocks that cut the line. No direct evidence confirmed this sequence, yet the modeling aligned with prior minor incidents recorded in archived notes. The investigative summary leaned on timelines built from radio silence, soft sightings, and flotsam that could travel widely between tides. A ranger from Huna urged a broader sweep toward channels where currents sneak around into unlikely pockets after long flood cycles. Teams walked beaches between Gustavus Flats and remote coves, talking with anglers who watched the weather stall without fully clearing. Some anglers remembered a light, late roar that sounded like wind against fur, which the report treated as ambiguous noise. The absence of consistent debris made every hypothesis feel more like a chart line than a settled route. State records document that family members arrived within a week, sat with maps, and asked for any proof beyond soggy paper. The park arranged rooms and daily briefings where night shift returns were read aloud with steady voices and careful phrasing. One meeting paused when a radio squealed on a distant desk, which briefly raised heads before the tone settled to a routine call. A liaison reportedly described how glacial bays keep and release things on schedules that ignore search grids and human clocks. That line echoed through notes, though the summary avoided metaphor and kept to distances, bearings, and tide spans. A second pass, months later, uncovered a hard hat trapped under root wad tangles near a creek mouth south of Geikie. The hat band had two initials that matched Dana, though tape adhesive lifted when dried, which limited certainty. Tool marks along the rim looked ordinary, the kind made by brush and rock during fast water drops after rain. Investigators never confirmed whether the hat drifted from the original work zone or from unrelated transport on a different week. Records conflict about when the creek last flooded high enough to carry light gear out across the inner bay. The final report avoided a single cause, and the language reads like a ledger that refuses to overstate unknowns. It lists weather instability, marginal visibility, and complex tides in a coast cut by steep walls that focus wind without warning. It notes an apparent failure of scheduled radio checks during a 2-hour window that stretched before active search began. It names the crew, their roles, their route, and the known objects found without embellishment or dramatic framing. It closes by acknowledging that no remains were recovered, while urging periodic shoreline checks during future maintenance flights. A maintenance season reopened the next year with new check-in rules and duplicated radio prompts at midday and last light. Crews now carry waterproof slates for brief status notes, and route sheets include alternate coves where ground holds are safer. Supervisors added a second lanyard check on kill switches after hearing recurring stories about unexpected clips popping during rough rides. Those changes live in training binders that reference this case by number and not by narrative, which the staff understands. The binder index points to a county file from 2009 that happens to store similar coastal incident templates. People around Gustavus still mention the team when weather drops low and the channel flattens, with strange quiet at slack. A marina clerk remembers Dana weighing spare chain on a handheld scale, making sure the anchor would bite into mixed gravel. A mechanic recalls Chris laughing about a stubborn plug while methodically reseating the wire to satisfy his own standards. Some locals claimed they saw 3 distant figures on a bar that night, though distance turns sure shapes into moving smudges. The record keeps the account open while the bay holds its own patterns, and the trail waits under wet green. The tunnel collapse outside Talkeetna. Locals in Talkeetna still mention the sound that rolled across the Spruce Flats shortly after dinner on a warm evening. A dull report, followed by a long shiver, came from the service tunnel east of the park's highway pullout where tourists park. Some residents said the ground trembled like a freight car slipping its brake, while others described a brief settling hush. Investigators never confirmed a single cause, and the first accounts arrived scattered across radio traffic like drifting snow. The earliest entry in dispatch logs marked a vague disturbance with no location pinned to a milepost. The service tunnel lay under a retired gravel spur that once fed a small quarry along the Susitna River flats near Talkeetna. Built for drainage and utility access in the 1970s, it carried cables and a narrow culvert beneath the raised bed. State records held surveying notes that described fractured silt lenses and frost heave risks beneath the pad, though the quarry closed decades later. During breakup, the culvert took meltwater toward a muskeg swale where moose browsed willow shoots every spring. The structure looked ordinary from the road, which likely explains why few people noticed changes through late summer. On the day of the collapse, a maintenance foreman named Mark Ellison drove north from Wasilla with a coil of fiber line. He was 52, employed by a regional contractor that serviced rural communication runs across the borough. His work order listed a periodic inspection of ground boxes near the decommissioned spur with a note about intermittent signal loss. Archived notes from earlier site checks mentioned minor seepage around a junction pedestal, but no structural objection recorded beyond seasonal frost. Ellison told his dispatcher he expected a quick look and promised to be back before dark reached the river bars. At the same time, a seasonal guide named Lena Ortega left town in a dusty crossover to scout a shortcut for autumn tours. She was 29, employed by an outfit that led small groups to river overlooks and berry patches outside Talkeetna. The proprietor reportedly wanted a safer route that avoided the rutted turnoff where buses stuck during heavy rain last year. Ortega carried a laminated map, a handheld radio, and a habit of text updates that showed time-stamped pings near the highway. The route she intended traced close to the old spur, where alder thickets crowded the edge of the embankment. The third person to figure later was Deputy Caleb Rusk, who logged on for an evening patrol from the borough substation. He was 41, a steady responder who preferred paperwork correct and calls closed without drama when roads iced. Rusk's shift calendar placed him between Talkeetna and Sunshine when the first complaint reached the radio net from a tourist. Some locals claimed they heard the report minutes earlier, which made the timeline messy before the first officer reached the pullout. County File from 2009 described similar confusion during a culvert slump near Willow that produced mismatched clock stamps across channels. According to dispatch logs, Ellison checked in at a utility box at 1943 with routine language and a calm tone. He then called again at 1950, giving a short remark about water inside the pedestal that soaked a bottom bracket. The recording cut with a click that sounded like a glove against a mic, which technicians later marked as incidental noise. Investigators never confirmed whether he entered the tunnel or remained beside the hatch that led to the concrete throat. His truck stayed parked on the gravel with a door ajar, as if he meant to return after a brief inspection. Ortega texted a coworker at 1955 with a photo of berry ground glinting under long sun near the spur. She followed with a second photo of tire ruts that curled toward willows beside the embankment where the tunnel sat unseen. The message after that used a shorter line about a hollow sound underfoot, which could have meant an old box. Some locals claimed she loved writing dramatic notes that overstated ordinary field quirks, yet her manager disputed that habit later. Her radio chirp at 1959 carried wind and water like a whisper when recorded on the station console. Rusk parked at the pullout at 2011 and met two travelers who reported dust rising near the alder screen by the spur. He walked the gravel shoulder and saw Ellison's truck with hazard lights clicking against an empty quiet that felt slightly wrong. The deputy radioed for a welfare check at the site and requested a second unit from Sunshine with standard cautionary wording. He then followed a footpath that split through hops of sedge where the ground thinly crusted above damp peat. His flashlight found the hatch leaning crooked with one hinge bent, while small stones slid into a widening dark gap. Engineers later wrote that the tunnel roof probably sheared along a cold joint that never bonded cleanly during original placement. Freeze-thaw cycles likely pushed against that line until an unusually wet season softened the surrounding silt enough to let it move. State records mentioned runoff totals that exceeded mid-range by several inches during late May and again in early August. Whether vibration from traffic or a subtle settling tick crossed the final threshold remained uncertain after multiple modeling attempts. The concrete segments slumped in stages which matched witness comments about two distinct sounds separated by minutes rather than a single collapse. Search activity began before midnight, with lights cast across low trees and a slow noise like a generator on a far porch. Volunteers from Talkeetna cleared brush while a tow driver secured Ellison's truck away from the lip where the gravel cracked. A rope team placed anchors on the railbed and dropped cameras that showed fractured slabs and water pooling in blind pockets. Some locals claimed a man called up from the dark, which others dismissed as static and wind refracting inside concrete. Investigators never confirmed a voice, and the audio clip on the case server held only hiss and sloshing echoes. By morning, a pump crew from the borough moved water while a geotech plotted safe zones along a chalked line on the pad. Ortega's crossover appeared on a game camera a mile south around dusk, which placed her near but not fixed at the site. Her phone last pinged a roadside tower at 2023 and then went quiet, which technicians called ordinary for that valley. Archived notes from similar corridors described shadow zones that confuse signals when weather and terrain line up against small devices. The absence complicated mapping, yet did not prove movement one way or another before responders closed public access around the spur. Ellison's helmet turned up near the hatch with a scrape across the brim that matched a hinge corner on the broken lid. His tool belt sat on the gravel with a coil of line draped across a stake as if he paused to check the latch. A narrow pry bar lay close by with a clean tip, which suggested the lid gave way without hard effort that night. Whether he stepped onto a floating slab or leaned across the opening stayed unsettled after interviews and simulations by the team. The working theory held that a small section slipped first, which invited a misstep followed by that deeper slide. Rusk wrote a measured report that avoided drama and kept his timestamps aligned with the console extracts on the server. He noted footprints that matched Ellison's boots on the lip and lighter prints that could fit Ortega, though soil made that uncertain. The deputy also logged faint prints from a moose calf that had crossed the pad earlier, which muddied impressions near the broken hatch. County file from 2009 warned about wildlife tracks, confusing scenes when soft fines overlay crushed river gravel near culverts. The manual suggested photographs at low angles, which the deputy used, while the second unit kept tourists away from the shoulder. Crews shored the tunnel by afternoon and advanced along brace spans with boards laid to float weight across pockets. Cameras revealed a backpack snagged on rebar with a company logo that matched Ellison's firm, yet the tag was not attached. A laminated map later washed from a side pocket and bore notes in tidy handwriting that matched Ortega according to workplace forms. Some locals claimed that proved they both went inside, while engineers countered the items could have slid from the surface during slumps. Investigators never confirmed sequence because sediment had moved like heavy smoke behind a fan that could not be rewound. 1 week later, divers explored the downstream culvert mouth at the Muskeg Swale and found a coil of fiber line in brown water. The coil lacked brakes, which suggested Ellison never pulled it through any conduit during his visit to the junction that night. A boot with lodgepole grit turned up near willow roots, which fit his size, yet showed no decisive mark beyond silt scuff. State records cataloged the item without a matching pair, which sometimes happens when suction holds one while the other drifts through. The absence of a second boot and the quiet along the pad kept theories moving without a single solid anchor. Interviews gathered at the roadhouse turned contradictory, where retired quarry hands remembered different drainage fixes done in the 1980s. Some recalled grout injections around the seam, while others remembered only gravel top-ups after a frost buckle that wintered poorly. Archived notes from a subcontractor folder described planned reinforcement that later carried a red stamp that read "postponed by budget." Whether the work happened under a different purchase order remained unclear because several boxes from that period were flooded during a roof leak. The record trail thinned like tracks after a thaw, which made the structural story patchy and dependent on memory that wandered. Ortega's manager shared messages that painted a careful worker who kept to daylight and logged routes on a paper pad. A page from that pad surfaced near the embankment a month later with rain stains and a note about a hollow sound. Some locals claimed the note was showmanship, while others saw a cautious marker used to flag ground that felt suspect. Investigators never confirmed whether her last movements brought her to the hatch or just along the shoulder within sightlines. The company kept her name on the roster through the season, while the tours shifted to a northern loop near Sunshine. Winter closed around the tunnel with plywood bracing and a fence that leaned under snowdrift load as the highway quieted. Engineers sketched a full grout fill for spring, along with a new culvert and a plan to backfill voids with controlled material. State records noted that funding passed a final review with a brief line that mentioned the unusual uncertainty about human involvement. Whether anyone remained inside depended on unproven pre-collapse entries that lacked clear video or eyewitnesses on the gravel pad. Some residents left small flags on willow stems, while others drove by without slowing because the road carried too many questions already. When thaw returned, the crew pumped the tunnel again and advanced with boards across the span to the furthest stable chamber. They recovered a radio that matched Ortega's issued unit with corrosion that hid numbers, yet yielded one short clip of wind. The clip sounded like water coursing through a tight throat while gravel popped against concrete in the slack of a bend. Investigators never confirmed whether that audio preceded or followed the initial slump because digital clocks often drift during cold storage. The unit went into evidence, and the report added another uncertain marker to a file already layered with careful hedging. By summer, the borough signed off on repair, and the fence came down while the spur remained posted against foot traffic. A brass marker sits near the hatch that no longer opens, which says access limited and lists a phone number for permits. The marker stands beside a low alder where berries gather in small clusters that dye fingers purple by late August. Some locals claimed a shape moves under the pad during heavy rain, though the engineer insisted it is water finding the new path. No officer wrote that claim into state records, and the county file holds only measured language about subsurface flow. What remains are names and a trail that winds through routine forms and brief decisions that often precede ordinary work. The forms placed Ellison at a quiet junction with a simple task, while extended daylight made schedules stretch longer than intended. The notes placed Ortega near scenic ground where tourists look for berries while guides keep them from soft edges. Rusk moved between stops along the highway like any deputy in a spread-out borough where minutes stretch and details scatter. The file closes with repairs completed and a line that reads, "Outcomes unresolved," which is common language when records conflict and rumors persist. The stories. The night guard, who logged footsteps beneath the church basement. He logged the first footsteps at 2:14, then again at 3:05, and nothing about those times made sense. The basement lights stayed off, the motion sensor blinked idle green, yet something moved under the concrete where no hallway existed. The night guard was named Alaric Boone, age 54, a retired freight dispatcher who took quiet work after his divorce. He covered the overnight shift at a weathered church on a bluff, a place with a gym, a pantry, and a low stone basement. His simple goal for that Tuesday was making rounds, checking doors, keeping the coffee hot, and finishing a crossword before sunrise. During his second loop, he heard the first set, a faint two-beat rhythm under the boiler room, steady and human. He froze by the cinder block wall, his pencil lifted, and he realized he could feel the vibration through his shoes. He marked the time in his pocket notebook, then radioed a single check-in to keep the board honest. The church sat near a small river where old mills once ran, and tunnels stitched the slope like forgotten seams. He had heard stories from lunch volunteers about a coal chute, a dumbwaiter, even a choir passage sealed long ago. None of those old features mapped exactly to the boiler room, which sat on fresh concrete poured after a flood in 2005. Alaric finished the round and told himself it was heat pipes, which seemed reasonable, though the tempo was wrong. The boiler was off to save fuel, set to wait closer to dawn, and the thermostats showed a flat night. He waited near the fuse panel and heard it again, slow steps south to north, then quiet like someone listening. He walked upstairs and checked the parking lot, which held a single sedan from a choir tenor who worked late. Across the street, the antique shop was dark, its sign unlit, the display of rotary phones a grid of dust. The guard wrote the second time down, circled it, and added a question mark he would rather have avoided. He kept a clean log because writing straight helped his nerves. A trick learned dispatching trucks through winter storms. His notebook already listed door tests, flashlight levels, and notes about the food pantry deliveries with initials and counts. Now it held two odd entries about a place that should have been solid fill and reinforced slab. On Wednesday, he set a baseline, because the simplest first step is confirming the pattern before trying explanations. He arrived 10 minutes early, brewed coffee, and walked the perimeter before the staff left and the alarms armed. He chalked a thin line along the boiler room floor, just a mark to see if any hairline crack shifted. At 2:17, he felt the same two-beat rhythm. Heel, then toe, careful, like someone stepping between puddles. It moved toward the old pantry wall, paused, then returned, and he heard a small scrape, as if brushing stone. He checked the chalk line and found nothing disturbed, which frustrated him more than if he had found scuffs. He called the on-call contact listed as Pastor Lionel Cade, age 61, a spare-voiced man who rarely slept. The pastor answered and said the church once tied into a storm culvert and the city sealed it after floods. He added that the map might be wrong, since old projects drifted from paperwork when donations moved faster than permits. The footsteps returned at 3:11, and he recorded them by holding his phone against the wall, letting the mic listen. The audio picked up a rhythmic, bassy thump and a single metal tick, like a ring hitting a pipe. He labeled the file with the date and the time and sent it to himself because he backed up everything. On Thursday, he walked the block in the afternoon and spoke with Rhea Voss, age 47, the daytime custodian. She said a volunteer once mentioned a hatch under the choir risers, then shrugged and said that was before her time. She also said a city crew excavated near the alley last winter, chasing a water pressure loss on the block. He pulled the Public Works hotline and asked for archived lines, using calm words and the steady cadence that gets patience. The operator routed him to records, where an email arrived with basic utility diagrams marked revised after 2005. The drawing placed a retired branch running 30 feet under the church, labeled Service Abandoned with a faint dotted spur. He printed the map and folded it into his pocket, then took his shift with a small knot riding his stomach. That night, the sound came earlier, 1:59, and closer to the north foundation, which meant a path existed. He pressed his ear to the block, ignored the smell of dust and fuel oil, and heard soft breathing between steps. He decided to compare his notes against external clocks, a habit from dispatch that filtered coincidence from signal with patience. He checked transit schedules and found a freight delivery to the antique shop at midnight every other day, closed route. He marked those days with a triangle in the margin, then noticed the footsteps fell hours after the truck departed. On Friday, he asked the food pantry director, a patient woman named Mavis Alcott, age 50, whether someone used the basement. She said the pantry closed at 6 and the keys were tracked. Then she looked worried and asked if something happened. He told her he heard odd noise, nothing dangerous yet, and he would keep her informed before calling the police. He reached out to a friend who knew Boots by tread, a park ranger named Pietro Licari, age 42. Pietro listened to the phone recording and said the spacing suggested a careful adult, not a kid, likely carrying weight. He told Alaric to watch for a scrape on the off foot, a marker of someone testing boards or stones. That night, Alaric brought a cheap wildlife camera from a hardware store, just a unit that logged sound and temperature changes. He set it in the boiler room, not for video since there was nothing to see, but for time-stamped audio. He also sprinkled a narrow ribbon of flour near the expansion joint because footprints sometimes post where eyes cannot. At 2:08, the floor hummed lightly, the air felt cooler near the wall, and the camera clicked after a shift. Later, he played it back and heard a new detail, a small spray like water under pressure, then a hand tap. It sounded like someone touched a pipe and felt for vibration, which made the knot in his stomach tighten. On Saturday afternoon, he visited the public library and asked for old fire insurance maps, the kind surveyors hoarded. The librarian brought a set from 1948 and 1963, which showed a coal room under the choir. A narrow passage ran toward the river, marked as service, with a note stating shared utility with neighboring parcel. The neighboring parcel matched the antique shop, which made sense to old builders who shared trenches and split costs when money was scarce. He copied the sheet and took it to the pastor, who studied the lines, then sighed and rubbed his jaw. The pastor said a previous board closed the passage after a minor flood, then let the city handle whatever remained. Alaric asked permission to open the old choir risers to check for a hatch, and the pastor agreed to supervised access. They pulled 2 sections and found only plywood and dust, which meant the hatch was either gone or moved. Yet along the north sill, a set of nails showed different age, darker and uneven, as if boards were reused. That night, the footsteps ran later, almost 4, and quicker, like someone in a hurry who disliked being underground. He thought about calling the police, but worried he would deliver a false alarm and lose the trust he needed. Instead, he called the non-emergency line and reported suspicious subterranean noise, and the dispatcher logged it with a routine number. On Sunday morning, a congregant named Basil Ortega, age 60, told him he once saw steam venting in the alley. Basil said it happened near a rusted rectangle that looked like an access panel, then he made a helpless shrug. He also said an unfamiliar white van loaded crates behind the antique shop 2 nights earlier, long after the truck left. Alaric used his lunch to walk the alley, where he found a metal cover sunk into cracked asphalt beside an old drain. The cover was not city standard, the screws mismatched, the edges marked by recent scrapes where a bar pried. He took photos from 3 angles and emailed them to the pastor, then placed a tiny pencil mark by a bolt. He returned that night and listened, and when the footsteps began, he watched his phone clock and checked the flour. The new powder held a single faint dent by the joint, not a full print, but enough to show pressure. He leaned closer and smelled faint bleach, which meant someone cared about leaving little behind, a detail that narrowed possibilities. On Monday, he flagged the city water department and asked whether any reports showed pressure fluctuations overnight in that block. A supervisor called back and said there were brief spikes every few nights around 3, like a valve opening and closing. He added that an inspector noted a missing cap on a retired service branch near the river last winter. That call changed the tone, because pressure spikes paired with footsteps turned from mystery to infrastructure problem with risk. He told the pastor he would ask police for a walkthrough, then called the same dispatcher and requested a non-emergency assist. A patrol officer arrived with calm posture and a flashlight, listened to the audio, and agreed to a careful look. They checked the alley cover first and found the pencil mark missing, replaced by a fresh smear of dirt and oil. The officer requested a utility truck, and a crew appeared with a wrench and a portable meter that hummed softly. The crew measured sound through the cover and picked up flow. Not strong, but a whisper moving in pulses like breathing. They paused for a supervisor, who arrived with a locked case that held a camera snake used on drains and conduits. The team fed the lens past the cover and into a rough concrete passage that curved toward the church foundation. The view showed shoe scuffs on the dust, then a brass T-valve patched into an old water line with tape. The supervisor killed the street feed, then pointed at the tape and said someone had no license for that kind of work. He also said a misthreaded cap could vent gas from the adjacent service, which shifted the conversation from curiosity to hazard. The officer requested a second unit to secure the block, and they cleared the alley while keeping voices low. Inside the church, Alaric stood by the boiler room while the utility meter ticked, confirming a slight pressure bleed through the slab. The footsteps started again, softer this time, then stopped when the water cut out, which pinned the pattern with confidence. He radioed the officer, who whispered that someone was still down there, then signaled the team to quiet. A darker shape glided past the camera lens, and a hand reached to the valve, then froze when it found no resistance. The hand wore a thin mechanic glove with a tear at the knuckle, a detail that stood out like a flag. The officer announced presence through the cover, voice firm without volume, telling the person to stay still and breathe easy. A minute stretched heavy, then a voice answered, shaky and tired, saying he was stuck because the valve handle jammed. The team opened the cover and escorted out a man in his late 30s, pale, layered in dust and damp. He gave his name as Trenton Vale, age 38, the owner of the antique shop across the street with deliveries. He said he entered the old service passage months ago after a plumber showed a way to run a supplemental water line. He said he needed pressure for cleaning and steaming items, though his meter and bills did not match the usage schedule. He admitted he liked the privacy, then insisted he never touched the gas, which the utility crew would later verify. They checked his shop and found a narrow door behind a rack of film cameras that opened onto the same cracked alley. There were wet footprints on the threshold, hex-patterned soles with a little drag on the right, matching the sound spacing. There was a box of brass fittings, a saw with minimal filings, and a cardboard tray holding mismatched valve caps. At the station, according to the later report, he told them a contractor left the tool and he only learned by watching. He said the passage felt safer at night because the street was empty and he liked the quiet under the church. He also said he heard a bell once through the stone and timed his movements between scheduled campus patrols. The city documented the patched valve, sealed the retired branch, and fined the shop for unauthorized connection and trespass through utility right-of-way. The gas line near the valve showed no tampering, which eased everyone, though the near miss tightened throats along the block. The police shared a copy of the dispatch log, noting the initial call as checked and secured. Ulrich printed the log and glued it into his notebook beside the first pencil scrawl about the 2-beat rhythm. He added a short summary stating that the footsteps tracked to an illegal water tap under the slab, then paused. He wrote that the timing aligned with utility spikes, and the alley cover thread marks confirmed regular access before the shutdown. The pastor thanked him in a staff meeting, with witnesses confirming calm handling and careful records that guided city response. Rhea patted his shoulder and said the flower idea was odd and smart, then promised to mop where he dusted. Mavis delivered coffee and said the pantry would have closed for days if the water had been fouled by sediment. Pietro called and laughed softly, saying the drag heard in the recording matched the right boot scuff found at the door. He said the pattern on the sole looked like an old surplus boot, hex blocks that turned slick on damp concrete. He liked that a simple tape recorder pinned a path better than a dozen guesses and said, "Well done." Weeks later, the utility crew returned and filled the passage with flowable mix, a gray slurry that hardens without voids. They left a small marker in the alley for the map, a stamped square showing the retired line and closure date. Inside the boiler room, the floor stayed quiet. The green light blinked the same, and the chalk line gathered dust. People asked Alaric if he was scared while listening to footsteps underneath, and he always answered with a half smile. He said fear is different from alert, and alert is what he used when tracking trucks through black ice before sunrise. He also said the quiet afterward felt heavier than the noise because silence makes you question whether you imagined everything. He kept the notebook in his locker and reread the first pages when he doubted why small details matter during routine nights. The triangle marks still sat by the delivery days, and the circles still highlighted the times that repeated like a clock. He had added a final entry, stating that listening is a skill, and that meters and maps are companions. Trenton kept the shop open under a suspended operations agreement, limited hours, supervised water, and a written promise about deliveries. He came by once with a receipt and asked the pastor to sign a community service form for repair work around the lot. He paused near the boiler room door and stared at the concrete, then thanked Alaric without meeting his eyes. Alaric nodded and said, "Take care," then wrote a line later that night about how people choose their own pressure. He meant water and he meant life, and the line read corny on the page, so he crossed a word and moved on. He folded the notebook closed, poured fresh coffee, and walked the church perimeter while the river hummed under the bluff. He still listened in places others ignored because careful listening had made a map where drawings ended and footsteps began. He carried the printed utility sketch until the paper softened, then kept the new revised copy with the closure stamp. He filed both in a manila folder labeled basement under the church, just a marker in case memory failed years later. In his mind, the story stayed simple. A man heard footsteps where no hallway should run and wrote the times carefully. The notes pressed outward into witnesses, maps, meters, and one rusted cover that told the truth when a bolt turned. The payoff was not drama, but a good fix, which is better, and the quiet afterward made sense again.